Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everybody. We're very excited as director of Yahadinun to welcome you all today and to have Suzanne Brown-Fleming from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. There's not only a big friendship from many years, but it's also a wonderful cooperation between Jihad in Unum and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and especially with Susan and all the programs that we have done for so many years. So Susan, welcome. Tonight, I just would like Father Dubois to make an introduction of yourself.
So it's an honor for me to introduce Suzanne Brown-Fleming. First, who is she? I think first she's a mommy of wonderful girls and who are now nearly young women. And she's also a very, very hard-working person, working since so long time about archives, Vatican archive, German archives, and raising this question, this very difficult question about the question of guilt, not guilt, responsibility of the Catholic Church during Holocaust and first in Germany. And so I know her since long time. She's first a friend. She's first a dedicated mother and a dedicated researcher, and also a dedicated, you will see, a speaker. She knows how to speak to people in a very pedagogical way, in a very easy way. So I would say anybody wants after to invite Suzanne Fleming somewhere to speak, it's surely a success. And she has the sensibility to transmit complicated question, sensitive question to a large public. So I would like you to welcome her. And we are very, very proud, Suzanne, that you speak to us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. And before we begin, I have to give my caveat, and that is that I need to note for the record that the views expressed in this lecture are mine alone and do not necessarily represent those of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or any other organization. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes, maybe a little more, and then we'll open for questions. So I need to express my honor and pleasure to be invited by Yahad and Unum to deliver this lecture. I met Father Dubois in the fall of 2005, and I remember this because Father Dubois generously accepted an invitation to come to our home for dinner, and I was cooking while wearing my new baby Eleanor in one of those papoose carriers so I could have the use of my two hands to prepare the food, and Father Dubois called me a hero mother, and I was totally charmed from that minute on. My husband Mark and I were preparing dinner that evening for Father Dubois and my colleague Paul Shapiro, and that night Father Dubois showed us the incredible photographs that he and his team had made in Busk, Ukraine. And since that evening, Father Patrick, Marco, Andre, Patrice, Hannah, and his other amazing and brave team members have become part of our family. And this virtual evening is very special for me for that reason. And I'd also like to make two dedications this evening for my lecture, Open Vatican Archives for the Pontificate of Pius XII. First to Cardinal Andre Ventois, who helped our family in a time of need. And also to my dear friend, Holocaust survivor Randy Bram of blessed memory, who passed away in 2018. So I'm gonna bring us back to 2 decades ago. As a blissfully naive, late 20-something PhD candidate in modern German history at the University of Maryland, College Park, I'd finally landed on a dissertation topic and had arrived at the Catholic University of America's archive in Washington, DC. And I learned that Catholic University housed the personal papers of Cardinal Aloysius Munch, who you see here. This American-born Cardinal Munch was the most powerful American Catholic figure and influential Vatican representative in occupied Germany and subsequent West Germany between 1946 and 1959. Cardinal Munch held the diplomatic positions of apostolic visitor, regent, and finally Pope Pius XII's nuncio or papal diplomat to Germany. I was delighted to have access to his personal papers because typically the papers of papal diplomats are held in the Vatican's own archives in Rome. And in one of those accidents of history, Cardinal Munch had shipped the bulk of his papers to the United States so that a young American priest could utilize them to write a biography. So happily for me, his papers stayed in America. And so I arrived on my first day, put on my white gloves, which you needed back in the day, and requested the collection. One of the first things I came across was a 1957 correspondence between Cardinal Munch and Monsignor Joseph Adams of Chicago. Munch was describing his most recent audience with Pope Pius XII on a spring day in Rome. Munch and Pius were close, bonded by their ties to and love of Germany and its people. They were at ease with one another, and by the time of this audience had worked together for over 11 years. In this particular May 1957 audience, the Pope, and I'm quoting him now, told Munch a story with a great deal of delight. I continue to quote Pope Pius XII here, quote, "Hitler died and somehow got into heaven. There he met the Old Testament prophet Moses. Hitler apologized to Moses for his treatment of the European Jews. Moses replied, 'Such things were forgiven and forgotten here in heaven.' Hitler was relieved," continued the Pope, and then said to Moses, quote, "He, Hitler, had always wished to meet Moses in order to ask him an important question. Did Moses set fire to the burning bush?" So let me stop here for a moment to explain the two references in this joke. The Pope was making an equivalency between two historical events. The first, the Jewish prophet Moses' arbitration of the 10 Commandments to the Jewish people after an angel of God appeared to him in a burning bush. The second, Hitler's rumored involvement in the 1933 Reichstag Parliament fire, an event that facilitated consolidation of Hitler's dictatorial powers. Munch closed his letter to Monsignor Adams with this line, "Our Holy Father told me this story with a big laugh," end quote. So here I was, feeling dumbfounded, among other things. The delight and laughter described by Cardinal Munch indicated to me that neither the Pope nor Munch himself appeared to understand the inappropriateness of telling a joke relating to the murder of 6 million European Jews. To my eyes, this exchange between them, one a prince of the church and the other in the chair of St. Peter as God's representative on earth for faithful Catholics like myself, demonstrated to me that neither placed much importance on the Jewish experience under National Socialism. Some might even say it captures the failure of the institutional Roman Catholic Church to undertake a strong and public position of sensitivity, respect, and a positive action vis-a-vis Jews and Judaism during the papacy of Pius XII. But what could be carefully researched was limited by the fact that at that time, in the late 1990s, the full archives of Pius XII were still closed. No longer. On March 2nd, 2020, these archives fully opened. Announced by Pope Francis on March 4th, 2019, on the 80th anniversary of the election of Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, to the office of Pope, these new archives consist of an estimated 16 million pages in dozens of languages, spread across multiple archives in Rome and Vatican City. In an ironic twist of history, the much anticipated archives had to close after 4 days due to the COVID-19 pandemic. They reopened in early June, and considering normally scheduled summer closures in July and August, researchers have so far had less than 90 actual days in the archives. Today, I will reflect on their early research findings and the meaning of these archives for Christian-Jewish relations. The church is complex, and so are its archives. Nor are the archives that opened this year completely new. Important but incomplete documentation has been available beginning in 1965 as part of the published series Acts and Documents of the Holy See relative to the Second World War. Also already available are archives from the Pontificate of Pius XI, available in full since 2006, and those of the Vatican Office of Information for Prisoners of War, available since 2004. For scholars of the churches, during World War II, the Holocaust, and the post-war period, we are witnessing an exciting moment. I'm going to first talk about findings in the archive from the perspectives of what we learned this last decade from the archives covering the years 1922 to 1939. I will then move to preliminary early findings that have begun to appear since last March. No modern pope has been as scrutinized as Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII. Soft-spoken, aristocratic, trained in law and diplomacy, scholars have only been able to study Pope Pius XII through through Vatican documents up to 1939, the end date of Pope Pius XI's reign. Sometimes called Il Papa Tedesco, the German Pope, Pius XII was enormously popular with the German people during his time as papal diplomat to Germany from 1917 to 1929. From 1930 to 1939, he served Achille Ratti, Pope Pius XI, as Secretary of State, the second most powerful position in the Vatican hierarchy. When he then became Pope in 1939, he controlled the worldwide Catholic Church and the tens of millions of Catholics in Europe on the brink of war. Now, portions of the Vatican's archival record for the 1922 to 1939 period are available at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. With thousands of archival pages at my disposal in the museum's reading room, 3 growing children and a full-time job, I decided to approach the material by looking at 2 key events in Holocaust history: the response of the Vatican and the German Catholic Church to the first anti-Jewish laws in 1933, and to the Night of Broken Glass pogrom in 1938. My detailed findings are published elsewhere. Here, let me just try to capture some highlights. Let's go back to March 1933. On March 23, 1933, the German parliament passed the so-called enabling law, abolishing democracy and the constitutional state in Germany. For our purposes, of a special interest is a statement German Chancellor Adolf Hitler made promising to respect all treaties between the churches and the states, and insisting in public that the rights of the churches would not be infringed upon. In response, on March 28, 1933, the German Catholic Bishops' Conference, seated in the city of Fulda, removed the ban that at that time was active on Catholic membership in the Nazi Party. On the same day that the Fulda Bishops' Conference reversed the ban on Nazi Party membership for German Catholics, the Nazi Party itself ordered a boycott to begin on April 1st at 10 a.m., directed against Jewish businesses, department stores, lawyers, and physicians. A second discriminatory law quickly followed. On April 7th, the passage of the so-called Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service contained the so-called Aryan paragraph, stipulating that only those of Aryan descent could be employed in public service. State-sponsored Nazi persecution of its Jewish population had begun. I was curious about the correspondence going to and coming back from the Vatican around these 2 extremely sensitive issues. Most surprising to me were letters to German bishops, to the nuncios, or to the Pope himself from German Catholics, including priests, who hoped to find some way to be both true to their bishops and to Hitler. I'll just give one example here. Princess Georg von Sachsen-Meiningen, who had joined the Nazi Party already in 1931 on her 36th birthday, tried to explain her distress in a letter to the Holy Father, the Pope. She was responding to the fact that in the fall of 1930, the pastor of Kirchenhausen bei Heppenheim in the Diocese of Mainz declared in a sermon that no Roman Catholic could be a member of the Nazi Party, and further, any active member of the Nazi Party could be refused the sacraments. Countess Clara Maria wrote to her Pope, quote, "As a good Catholic, I fear to end up in a conflict of conscience and to be in danger of punishment by the Church. If these measures and rules of the Mainz diocese are taken up by other dioceses, I will not be the only one to find myself in this conflict, but joined by hundreds and thousands of other men and women who have decided to heroically fight for culture or world opinion that will destroy Marxism and Bolshevism." End of quote, in a much longer letter with similar sentiments. So my colleague Kevin Spicer has admonished me that letters like this, and I agree, letters like this must be weighed against a population of nearly 30 million German Catholics. And what they tell us, nonetheless, is that fear of losing their flock to the growing Nazi movement was a factor in the Vatican and German Catholic Church's process, a decision-making process. In lifting their ban on Nazi membership for Catholics, a decision was made to compromise, especially if, as Hitler stated in his March 23rd address, the Church would be left alone. So this thinking was at play alongside prejudiced views of Jews buttressed by 2,000 years of Church teachings when the next test came, the April laws of 1933. Pope Pius XI himself was asked to intervene in a letter from unnamed, I'm quoting here, high-ranking Jewish notables. In an internal memorandum, the Pope transmitted this request to Secretary of State Pacelli, the future Pius XII. The precise language of Pacelli is important here, and I'm quoting him just briefly. "It's in the tradition of the Holy See to fulfill its universal mission of peace and love for all human beings, regardless of social status or religion." The memorandum then asked for the advice of the papal nuncio or diplomat in Germany, Cesare Orsenigo, and of the German bishops in formulating a response. The answer sent back from Berlin was clear. The Church should not intervene beyond conveying the will of Catholicism for universal charity. So why this response? Fear of alienating Catholics attracted to Nazism, fear of losing the independence of Church practices in the new Nazi state, and finally, the mentality best captured by the response of Cardinal Michael Faulhaber of Munich. In a letter dated April 10th, Cardinal Faulhaber, like Orsenigo, discouraged the Holy See from intervening. He wrote to Pacelli, quote, "Our bishops are being asked why the Catholic Church, as so often before in history, has not come out in defense of the Jews. This at present is impossible because the war against the Jews would also become a war against the Catholics. As the quick end of the boycott has shown, the Jews can defend themselves," end quote. So 5 years later, after the devastating Night of the Broken Glass pogrom, Secretary of State Pacelli would again receive a missive asking the Vatican to denounce what many consider to be the opening act of the Holocaust: total destruction of every Jewish man, woman, and child. This time the missive was from one of his own. Cardinal Arthur Hinsley, 5th Archbishop of Westminster, wrote to Pacelli requesting papal condemnation of the pogrom. Pacelli refused on behalf of the Pope, who had recently suffered a heart attack. The official Vatican response read as follows, quote, "The Holy Father Pius XI's thoughts and feelings will be correctly interpreted by declaring he looks with humane and Christian approval on every effort to show charity, to give effective assistance to those who are innocent victims in sad times of distress. It's very reminiscent to the 1933 Universal Language, signed by Cardinal Pacelli, Secretary of State to His Holiness. So we have another unambiguous example here that Pacelli, despite being informed about the horrendous details of the pogrom in Germany, was not encouraging of a public statement by the Holy See condemning Nazi Germany specifically, or the November pogrom specifically, or singling out suffering Jews, specifically by name, even when asked to do so by a prince of his own church. He was comfortable only with a statement broad enough to encompass all, quote, innocent victims. So to wrap up this topic of the 1922 to 1939 archives, these millions of documents still have so much potential. Open since 2006, 14 years have not nearly exhausted all the possibilities. For me, I learned the lesson that the response of the Catholic Church to Nazi treatment of Jews cannot be separated from the Church's response to Nazi treatment of Catholics during the 1920s and 1930s. What do I mean? The last weeks of March and first weeks of April 1933 make painfully clear that the Catholic Church's decisions and responses to persecution of their own co-religionists influenced and even dictated their tepid response to mistreatment of Jews. Another lesson: the role that 2,000 years of Catholic prejudice against Jews played from the lowest to highest levels of the Church must be and should be studied beyond the person of the Pope himself. The 1922 to 39 archives are rich with material from ordinary Catholics, their priests, nuns, bishops, cardinals, and from their Jewish neighbors, grasping for any help they might need and typically not finding it. So let's fast forward to March 2020, the juicy part you've all been waiting for. Since the opening on March 2nd, the fascination with the 1939 to 1958 materials has only grown. If we can have the next slide, Noel. A documentary by award-winning director Stephen Pressman, titled Holy Silence, premiered in January of this year. It garnered over 3,000 views when shown as part of a recent joint program between the Holocaust Museum and the Jewish Film Institute in San Francisco. An interview with Hubert Wolf, a historian at the University of Münster, whose team was among the first in the archives in March, went viral. And a next slide. More recently, Brown University historian David Kurtzer's article in The Atlantic on his research and his collaborators' findings in a resulted in a counter article in none other than L'Osservatore Romano. This is the daily newspaper of the Vatican city-state, which reports on the activities of the Holy See and events taking place in the Church around the world. So earlier this month, I stood in the Vatican Apostolic Archive for the first time in my life. Where does one begin with the many questions that I had been accumulating since that first day at Catholic University? With limited time to work in the archive, I decided to follow up on an old question that has nagged at me since those early days at the Catholic University archives, that of Pius XII's thought process as he pleaded for clemency for Germans indicted and convicted for war crimes by Allied courts in occupied Germany. Scholars have already established that Pius XII and his key advisors involved themselves in clemency efforts for convicted German war criminals, most especially for Catholic ones. I recalled that even Munch had questioned this practice, telling US High Commissioner John J. McCloy in 1950 that some championed by the Vatican were, quote, up to their elbows in blood. Selecting a folder labeled Prisoners of War, 1950 to 1959, from the papers of the Vatican's diplomatic headquarters in Germany, I started to turn the fragile pages in this beautifully appointed Pius XI study room. Midway through the folder, the subject heading Case Oswald Pohl caught my eye. Now, Oswald Pohl, just to give some of you the background on who he is, joined the Nazi Party in 1926 and the SS in 1929. The SS, or Schutzstaffel, was an elite quasi-military unit of the Nazi Party that served as Hitler's personal guard and as a special security force in Germany and the occupied countries. Oswald Pohl became chief of administration at SS headquarters in February 1934, responsible for armed SS units and the concentration camps. Ultimately, he headed a sprawling organization that was responsible for recruiting millions of concentration camp inmates for forced labor units, and also responsible for selling Jewish possessions, jewelry, gold fillings, hair, clothing, to provide funds for Nazi Germany. Next slide. On November 3rd, 1947, in the US versus Oswald Pohl et al., the US Army sentenced Pohl to death. During the 3-year confinement in Landsberg prison that followed, Pohl converted to Catholicism. This, however, did not prevent his execution by hanging on June 8th, 1951. So the dates in the folder sitting in front of me there in the PIUS XI room caught my eye as April 1951, less than 8 weeks before Pohl's execution date. There are 3 memos written in Italian from Nuncio Munch, headquartered at the time in Kronberg, Germany, to the Vatican's substitute Secretary of State, Giovanni Battista Montini, the future St. Paul Pope Paul VI, and at the time, Pius XII's closest advisor and friend. On April 2nd, Munch wrote to Montini, quote, "I consider it my duty to remit to your excellency newspaper articles which report news of the Holy Father sending a papal blessing to Mr. Oswald Pohl, former general of the SS, sentenced to death in Landsberg," end quote. The second memo was longer, also to Montini, future St. Pope Paul VI. It was more interesting and confirmed that indeed Oswald Pohl had received a papal blessing via telegram. Let me pause briefly again to explain that the apostolic blessing or pardon at the hour of death is part of the last rites in the Catholic tradition. The Christian News Service in Munich issued a clarification that according to Landsberg prison chaplain Karl Morgenschweiss, the telegram conferring the papal blessing was, quote, "purely private and not a diplomatic step or a Vatican stance," end quote. Specifically, a Father Costantino Pohlmann, who I haven't been able to find anything else about, sent an urgent request to Pius XII asking that the Pope send a papal blessing to Pohl on the eve of his death, in keeping with Catholic practice, and the Pope did so. In Munch's view, this was, quote, "not at all a matter of a telegram from the Vatican, much less a position taken by the Pope on the Pohl case," end quote. So in the third and final memo in this strangely labeled folder, Munch wrote to Montini a third time, and this time he took the time to send a copy of an essay that Oswald Pohl had written while imprisoned in Landsberg. This essay, many of you probably know it and have heard of it, was called, quote, "My Way to God," about Oswald Pohl's conversion experience while in Landsberg prison. So Munch assured Montini that the essay had come from the heart. Father Morgenschweiss, quote, "closely followed the radical change of Pohl, wrote the preface, and confirmed that in Father Morgenschweiss's eyes, Pohl converted, quote, only for the beneficial influence of God's grace, and marked, quote, the sincere return to the Lord of a misguided soul," end quote. So what are we to make of Pius XII granting the apostolic blessing or pardon at the hour of death to Oswald Pohl, a recently converted Catholic, condemned to death as one of the greatest Nazi overlords of the slave labor system, which resulted in the death of millions of people? A week in the new archives cannot answer such a question of moral, ethical, and historical significance, but it did provide for me at least a sense that more historical evidence exists in other parts of this or another of the newly opened archives. I believe the core story that we now tell about the Vatican, the Catholic Church, and the Holocaust will be fundamentally altered after historians have done their work, but it will take time. To conclude, why all this intense interest in these archives, 75 years after the end of World War II? And what might they mean for Christian-Jewish relations, which have been on a steady positive path since the Church's rejection of anti-Semitism as a sin with the Nostra Aetate Declaration of 1965? There's no doubt that some documents will bring to the fore very tough conversations. Other documents will be causes of celebration. The vast majority, I suspect, will engender elements of both. It is an overdue conversation and one that must be approached with humility before our Jewish brothers and sisters. For our church, my church, has much to answer for the Nostra Aetate Declaration does not erase all of the sins of the past. When announcing the opening of these archives, His Holiness Pope Francis said, quote, "The Church is not afraid of history, rather she loves it. I open and entrust to researchers this documentary heritage," end quote. This is our moment to study the past in a clear, responsible, and precise way. This is our moment to accept that we will find stories across the full spectrum of the human condition, from the most depraved to the greatest acts of kindness. This is our moment to be equally honest about both the failings and triumphs we are already finding from bottom to top. Thank you, and excuse my total Zoom goof.
Thank you very much, Susan. Wonderful and interesting presentation. I don't know if there are any questions, or maybe Father Dubois, you would like to comment on something?
I have a question. Is that the chat is disabled, so I don't know if I can speak it. So first of all, good afternoon, and thank you for this fulfilling webinar. I really liked it. But my question is that if Hitler said at first that the church was going to like work by themselves, exactly why or how did the persecution against some Catholics started? Thank you.
Yeah, it's an important question about the persecution of Catholics themselves. Do I understand you correctly? And when it started?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. I'm going to make a side comment before I answer. The issue of what Catholics endured at the same time that Jews were subject to the Holocaust is, it comes up a lot. And I think discussions about it need to be really careful. On the one hand, I had said in my lecture, the way the church responded to persecution of its own must be studied and is relevant to the way that the church treated the so-called Jewish question. At the same time, it's very tricky to discuss it in a way where we are shedding light and explaining, and that's our purpose. I'm not implying you meant otherwise, but let me answer your question too. The Nazi Party was totally anti-Catholic, and the persecution of the church started quickly and early. Even though this March 1933 declaration, Hitler said, no, I'm not gonna touch the churches, he immediately violated, and all through the summer of 1933, priests were arrested, and Catholic youth groups in Germany were shut down, and this whole pattern continued all the way through 1939, before the beginning of the war, where Catholic life didn't at all proceed as usual with the Nazi government. They were interfered with all the time and beaten up and jailed. When the war started in September 1939, that's when especially Polish Catholics and Polish Catholic priests began to be murdered by the thousands and sent to concentration camps by the thousands. And we do see a pattern, especially in Poland, but in occupation of all the countries, that Catholics were persecuted in a completely different way than were Jews, who were slated for complete extermination. And maybe I'll answer a question that I was given before, because I'm sure it's one on your minds about the so-called rat line. This is the question of war criminals who received documents, including through Vatican channels, to escape through Italy to Latin America. Sometimes the most egregious, we know some of the most famous cases, Eichmann, the Commandant of Treblinka, Stengel. So I have to say that I was not there long enough to find anything about this, though I did try. I would recommend Gerald Steinacher, my colleague at University of Nebraska, who is really, he and Uki Goni are really the world's experts on this. But it is worth just telling you kind of how it functioned and what role Montini, who's second most powerful person in the Vatican and met with the Pope daily, might have played. The way the so-called rat line worked was there was a papal commission called the Pontifical Commissione Assistenza, the PCA, that Pius XII founded in 1944 for the sake of helping returning prisoners of war and refugees. It had offices all over Italy. It had international offices, and these offices were split up by nationality. So 4 of the offices in Rome, the Hungarian office, the German office, the Austrian office, and the Croatian office, all have a reputation, and it's been documented that war criminals could come to their pontifical institutes there in Vatican City and could get the identification cards they needed and then could slip out to Latin America. And concretely, the way that these pontifical institutes aided the process for fleeing war criminals was someone would show up at the door and present him or herself as Tom Jones. And the Vatican, these PCA committees had standard pieces of paper where if somebody came to their door and said, this is my name and this is my birth date and this is where I'm from, they would simply record that and sign it. And then and on this basis, that person would get identity papers from the International Red Cross. So once they had their Vatican identity, proof of identity, and their International Red Cross proof of identity, then they would work to get out of Europe. And who these people were was not checked. So war criminals would use this method. They'd present themselves as someone else to go out of the country. Now, especially these four houses, the Hungarian, German, Austrian, and Croatian ones, knew that they were smuggling war criminals out, and it wasn't an open secret. It was in newspapers of the time. And to me, the question that I hope to start on in Rome, but I wasn't able to, is what role did Montini play? Montini is the future Saint Pope Paul VI. He's the second in command at the Vatican. What did he know? And that's the question we're all wondering now that the archives are open. Based on some other discoveries that have come out, David Kurtzer recently published a really important piece on the Finale affair. It's extremely likely that the way the Vatican functioned on the ground, Montini was fully aware of this problem. And in fact, he shut down these PCAs in 1950. So what we hope to find now is more evidence of that, concrete evidence of a paper trail, and what kinds of conversations he had, which I'm sure he did have with Pope Pius XII about that problem. So I know that was one question that someone had nailed in earlier.
Suzanne, if you don't mind, I will read a few questions of the chat.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Edward Westerman. By the way, Professor Westerman will also give a conference on the same program, Beyond Memory, at the beginning of December, on the 2nd of December. So we kindly invite you also to follow this conference. Edward is asking if you can compare the response of the German Catholic Church on the issue of euthanasia versus knowledge of the destruction of the European Jews.
it's a great question, and it's another one of those issues where we have to really, where the comparative is helpful. So the Nazi practice of killing the so-called mentally ill or disabled or asocials, etc., that process began actually before mass murder of Jews, and in fact was something of a practice ground. Many of the personnel who were involved in these euthanasia killing centers then moved on to the death camps in the East. There, Bishop Clemens August von Galen, the Lion of Münster, forcefully spoke out in a specific way. And we were heard already in my lecture that Pacelli before had just given these very general universal messages. Von Galen stood at the pulpit and said, mass murder of the so-called disabled, etc., is a sin. It's against the law of God, and Catholics should object to this. And that sermon resulted in Hitler and his henchmen actually halting the euthanasia process. There were still wild euthanasia facilities, but there was a public impact. Speaking out in a public specific way in the case of von Galen and euthanasia meant that that process was slowed down, not stopped, but slowed down. And that's often a point that people scholars talk about this as maybe that could have happened if the church was more willing to be public and specific about Jews.
Suzanne, Suzanne, I would like to raise one question about the rat lines. Do you think it would be enough to open the archives until 45 to be clear about that, or it would be necessary to open the archives after, at least until 50? Because I see the red lines, it's a long processes, and with Argentina, complex processes. So it concerns also the years after. And what is surprising for me is the amount of numbers of high-level personalities we know in the church who are involved, and also local bishops of Italy, and who knew who they were, who were the people, not only to the second question for Ratline, I would like your advice. I saw two hypotheses. One hypothesis was to say that, okay, the church was rescuing the people who were fighting against the communism. And so the other was that they were thinking that Soviet Union would finally take Italy and France and everything, and we will have to bring back these people.
Yeah.
I would like your advice about that.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the three top issues that scholars are interested in. That's probably number one. The archives for 1939 all the way through 1958 are open. So that's, and actually, I think we're coming to see pretty quickly that these post-war records, the 1945 to 58 piece, and the way Pius XII made decisions in that period is going to be the gift that nobody really thought about. And for the rat line, it's critical to look at that post-war trail. And you're right that bishops in Italy, they knew this was going on. There were houses along the way in the route that they participated in this. We have to suss out there was Pacelli's strong anti-communism and a willingness to help criminals or former Nazis who he thought could be helpful in the battle against communism. This was also an American interest, and the CIA and the Vatican were, former OSS, then CIA, were in touch about this and cooperating sometimes with these rat line issues. So I think we need to do a lot of work on it. And I know my colleague Gerald Steinacher will be also looking at that to follow up on his other work.
I say that because I will finish my intervention. I realized that at the highest level today in the church, I don't say the Pope, but many cardinals that I know, they have no idea about that.
Yeah.
They heard about the question of the Vatican and the Jews and the Holocaust, that they know it's a problem, I would say. But the rat line, even the name rat line, they don't know about it.
Yeah.
And so I would say it's a big boom if it was going in out. And also there are a lot of questions of money behind, not only extraction of people, but it was extraction of an amount of belongings and money, and back and forth to Argentina and Switzerland. And so my question, if you could be, it would be very helpful, I would say, the way you will get it out, not only as a scholar, but something very accessible to a large public.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you, at the highest level in the church, actually, even I spoke to Cardinal Lustiger, he told me, oh, also that, he didn't know.
And he had not heard about it.
No, I never heard about it.
And actually, somebody had sent in a question about the Vatican Bank, and the Vatican Bank funded the Pontifical Commissione Assistenza. So the money trail is, you're right, Father Patrick, and also to the other person who wrote in about this, we really have to follow the money trail, because some of the money that the Vatican Bank used to fund these PCAs, a percentage of those people going through were war criminals, and this money was helping them to get out of Europe. And the thinking there really needs to be sussed out. And for me, the question of anti-Jewish prejudice, where does that fall in? I think we can talk about the anti-communism, and we can talk about church concepts of mercy and forgiveness, of these, like Oswald Pohl, if that's really what was going on. But where do anti-Jewish sentiments play a role? I'm sure that they do. And I hope we can find in the new archives some more evidence of that.
There is another question from Kirill Pfefferman. It is known that most Nazi leaders had an issue with, or were even absolutely opposed to, the Catholic Church. Do new documents shed light on the secret sympathizers of the Church among top or regional Nazi leaders?
Can you just repeat the last part of that?
Do new documents shed light on the secret sympathizers of the Church among top or regional Nazi leaders?
Okay. I don't know. It's something to look for. In the kind of old historiography and narrative, Catholics, at least in Germany, were seen as less susceptible to Nazism than were Protestants. I think we're finding that that's less true than we thought, including at extremely high levels, but that's something we need to pursue in this new archive work.
There is also a question from Mark Fleming that you might know.
You mean the guy behind me?
Exactly. Is there a concern that historians and other researchers will start to publish the results of early research of archive materials before relevant material on a given subject has been exhausted? Or is there an organization of the archives that can be discerned now that would allow researchers to develop confidence that they've looked in the right place when exploring a given historical question within this newly available materials?
Honey, are you asking me whether historians are working together to get these results out? I'm a little confused by the question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just
so
curious
I'm
curious whether the landscape of the records is readily discernible, so that if you try to go in with a specific question, you have some confidence that you are hitting the right places within the archives.
The short answer is no. For example, finding this exchange on Oswald Pohl in one would expect it in the nunciature records because Munch was a nuncio, but in in prisoners of war, that's a really strange place to have found this set of memos. I can tell you that it's going to take forever because there are 6 major archives. They all have their own systems. And in the one archive that I was in last week or 2 weeks ago, the Vatican Apostolic Archive, one room is filled just with indexes, And the descriptions are good. But like any archive, I wouldn't say this is unique to the Vatican. Sometimes the most important tidbits are in some mislabeled folder, or so I don't think we can be sure that. I think we have to comb through everything over time, and I think the best way to mitigate this challenge is, and it's something that we're talking about actively at the museum with other partners that are doing this work, is to try to consolidate a group of researchers with the language skills and the with a perspective of going into these archives with an open mind to work together and share their findings, so that at least it can be a divide and conquer kind of strategy. I think that's the best we're going to be able to do. And I think it's going to take 5 to 10 years. We'll see flash stories. We already see some flash stories, but it will take some time to really rewrite the narrative.
We also have a question from Alessandro from the Memorial of Sardinia, Holocaust Memorial in Sardinia. Can we say about the sentence that was put after the war by some high-grade corporate in Vatican after the war about, we know that in Auschwitz were killed many Jews, but the most sad thing is that they were murdered baptized Jews. That some people in the church look at the Jews and the rescue from death only to arrive to their conversion to Christianism.
The role of conversion. This is going to be one of the most rich areas in these new archives, because yes, it's a fact that many Catholic convents, monasteries, individual families sheltered and rescued and thus saved the lives of Jews, especially Jewish children. And what could go along with that, I don't know if I should say typically, but let's say often went along with that was baptism of these individuals to the Christian faith. And then the struggle after the war about how were those baptisms valid, and what if baptisms under duress to save one's life, the baptized person didn't want to remain baptized after the war. So I think the question is, did the church see this as a way to gather more souls for its flock? I would say no. Everything I've seen so far, there's a bit of a distaste for suspicion of Jews who converted to Catholicism, even if they had done so in several decades before the Holocaust. You can see exchanges where more senior church officials and the Holy Office were really against these flash baptisms and saw so-called non-Aryan Christians, i.e. Those of Jewish descent, as separate and not quite Catholic enough. And this played a role in opportunities for immigration. So it's sort of the opposite. Rather than thinking this is an opportunity to increase the Catholic flock, there was a fear of increasing it with this element, which is not an element that the church wants. That there are exceptions, of course, to that.
So we might take a last question right now. There is a question from Angel. If in your own opinion, the actions of the Church of the Vatican were timely.
Just repeat that just one more time.
The actions of the Vatican were timely.
Timely.
I mean, like opportunistic, I think.
Oh. Did the church behave in an opportunistic manner? Well, this goes back to I think the deep question embedded in this whole topic, which is the Pope is the representative of Christ on earth for Catholics. He has this moral, ethical leadership role in the world for billions of Catholics, and yet he runs a city. He runs a city-state. He's a politician. He's a diplomat, and he is, at the time of the Holocaust, a good friend, Father John Palikowski, kind of put it this way: before 1965 Vatican II Council, the core of being a Catholic was having access to the sacraments, to make sure you could stay inside the sacraments. After Vatican II, the focus of everything is in the dignity of the human person. Very different. And I think that the actions and decisions of the Holy See were absolutely driven by protecting the ability to provide the sacraments, protecting church buildings, church property, Catholics themselves. I don't think that the new archives will change that. The decision was to remain neutral so as to best protect Catholics and Catholic life and Catholic property. So I don't know what adjective to put on that. But I do think that it's created a bit of a dilemma in the post-Vatican II world, because many younger Catholics or those who have left the church altogether ask themselves, well, do I want to be part of a church that puts human dignity above all else, whether this is a Catholic, a non-Catholic, whatever race the person is, etc. Or do I want to be in a church that's just about protecting itself? And yeah, so I struggle with how to label that.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for this fascinating presentation. Before giving maybe the floor to Father Desbois for last words, I just want to congratulate you again, and you have many people greeting you and saying you thank you for your presentation. A last announcement: the next conference of the program will be held on the 5th of November. And will be given by Andrzej Umański, the scientific advisor of Yahadi Nunum, and it will be about the persecution of homosexuals in Nazi Germany. So you will all get informed by email and our social networks about the how to connect, and we will also make available the agenda for the rest of the conference of the year in a few days. So thank you very much, Patrick, Marco.
Thank you.
Suzanne, you are great as always. You are very courageous also to go on in that research, because it's a very complicated and also psychologically complicated research, because it affects our feeling, our fidelity to the church, our relation with other Catholic will say the opposite, as you know. Me, I have always one question. I don't know if it will be possible to open. I don't know if there was a nuncio in Poland or not. And I never heard about the correspondence between this nuncio and the Vatican, because it's a key question, because all the camps were there, or the amount of Jews were killed there, Polish too. And so I think it would help a lot. And also another point I think would be important, perhaps the opening of these archives could also enlighten activities of other chief of state in connection with the Pope. Because we don't know, in fact, with whom the Pope was in contact at highest level during the war, and with whom he had a very good correspondence. As you know, the Pope's diplomacy normally is completely secret, and so you will have the luck, I think, that I would advise you to stay strong, because it's not easy to stay strong in that field. So thank you so much, and I'm so proud to know somebody who is academically honest and be a Catholic researcher.
Warm greetings from the girls, and I apologize to everyone about the Zoom disaster. It won't happen again.
Thank you very much, Suzanne.
Bye.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Suzanne.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.